This episode is sponsored by Circle K. Get the most savings on every gallon when you fuel with the Circle K Fleet Card. Learn more at CircleKFleetCards.com.
Hello and welcome to the State of the Fleet Industry, a weekly report produced by Automotive Fleet magazine, sponsored by Circle K. I'm Mike Antich, editor of Automotive Fleet, and today I'd like to examine what's occurring in the fleet industry for the week of January 17, 2022. And as the saying goes, you don't know where you're going until you know where you've been. And if you want to know what's in store for the fleet market in calendar year 2022, you need to understand the dynamics of the preceding year that has led us to where we are at this point in time. So with this as background, I like to compare calendar years 2021 against calendar year 2020, which, as we all know, was when the fleet industry hit rock bottom during the COVID-19 pandemic due to the unprecedented economic shutdown that created the worst year in the history of fleet management. And as a spoiler alert, while 2020 was indeed the worst year in the history of fleet management, calendar year 2021, while better, was not that much better. The purpose of this exercise is to quantify how much the fleet industry actually did recover in calendar year 2021. So with this in mind, I'd like to use two fleet indicators as barometers to gauge the recovery of the fleet industry. And these two fleet indicators are: one, total number of fleet miles driven per month, and two, the total number of fleet trips taken per month. These two data sets can be benchmarked against 2021 and 2020 to provide a very accurate assessment of fleet activity in which to compare these 2 years. So let's start our analysis with this chart that compares the total number of fleet miles driven in May-June 2020 against those driven in May-June 2021. And as we all remember, during May-June 2020 timeframe, the fleet industry was in the midst of an economic shutdown where only essential fleet vehicles were allowed on the road. All non-essential fleet vehicles were required to be parked. And in this chart, that's displayed on your screen, the information presented is comprised of industry-wide fleet data provided by the telematics company Geotab. All of the data displayed on this chart and in all the subsequent charts in this report have been aggregated and anonymized. And the reason I selected May-June 2020 as the time frame to benchmark was because during the economic shutdown, as I mentioned, only essential fleet vehicles were allowed in operation. As a result, it decreased the number of total fleet miles driven, which would be a very good indicator of the recovery when compared to same time frame 1 year later in 2021. So in the orange bar on the far left-hand corner of your computer screen, it shows the total number of fleet miles driven in May 2020 as 1.26 million miles, or 1,260,000 miles. And as you can see by comparing the two sets of data, there is definitely an uptick in total business miles driven for the months of May, June 2021, shown on the right, especially when compared to the same time frame during the prior year. However, the total number of fleet miles driven in 2021 was somewhat disappointing because it was far less than what most fleet analysts had anticipated, especially when knowing that we're going to be comparing a period of economic shutdown against a period when the full economy is recovering. The data does indeed show recovery, but it shows a very tepid recovery. So let's next examine the rate of fleet recovery from another perspective by displaying a new chart that identifies the total number of fleet trips taken by month. The data in this chart was also based on anonymized and aggregated fleet data provided by Geotab. And as you can see from the new chart displayed on your computer screen, the increase in fleet activity from May-June 2021 is similar to the 2 months in 2020. Again, there was no dramatic growth in the number of trips taken by fleets as many had expected, again pointing to a tepid recovery. So continuing with our analysis beyond the May-June timeframe, later in the calendar year 2021, as we can all remember, there was the emergence of the two new waves of COVID-19 virus, the Delta variant and the Omicron variant. And to determine the impact of these two new variants, Let's now compare November-December 2021 against November-December 2020. And as you can see from the new chart displayed on your screen, there was an increase in the total number of business miles driven in November 2021, which is shown in the blue bar on the right compared to November 2020, the blue bar on the far left. But the mileage was flat when comparing December 2020 against December 2021. And again, it points out to the fact that the recovery of 2021 was relatively anemic, despite the fact that it was being benchmarked against the abysmal data of 2020. And we saw similar trends in the next chart that is also displayed on your screen, which compares the total number of fleet trips in 2021 versus 2020, also based on data provided by Geotab. As you can see, the number of fleet trips taken in December 2021 were flat compared to December 2020. And one factor contributing to the lack of growth in the total number of fleet trips in December 2021 was most likely due to the widespread increase in the Omicron infections. But another factor points to a greater utilization of video conferencing tools as a substitute to traveling by fleet vehicle for an in-person meeting. And there are several factors supporting this hypothesis. First, the majority of employees still have yet to return to work. They're continuing to work from home, making it difficult to find a private and safe meeting venues to hold business meetings. And second, as we all know, the growth in the use of work-related video conferences has been nothing short of astronomical. And it's been documented that there's been a 535% increase in video conferencing since the start of the pandemic. In pre-pandemic times, many of these video conferences would have been held in person, but no longer. So in summary, there was really high hopes for a dramatic fleet recovery in calendar year 2021. But despite the optimistic predictions for recovery in 2021, the data shows that fleet did not have the anticipated and hoped for V-shaped recovery. The reality is that there was only tepid month-over-month increases in fleet activity in 2021, despite being compared against the data from calendar year 2020, which was in the midst of an economic shutdown with only essential fleet vehicles in operation. Let's hope that the trend lines for the total number of business miles driven and the total number of fleet trips taken will see a dramatic upward turn in calendar year 2022. But until then, I'd like to conclude my State of the Fleet Industry presentation for the week of January 17, 2022, and I'd like to thank you for watching.